I'm Vince Waldron, Professor of Communication Studies and Lincoln Professor of Relationship Ethics. And at ASU, I'm housed in the program of Communication Studies located at the West Campus. Forgiveness is an alternative to bitterness, alienation, and destructive conflict. These two quotations capture some important dimensions of forgiveness. The first, forgiveness is giving up the possibility of a better past, reminds us that holding grudges can be a waste of energy in our relationships. And the second comes from Desmond Tutu. There is no future without forgiveness, he wrote, after observing the peace and reconciliation process in his native South Africa. Forgiveness is a complicated phenomenon, and it's studied from multiple scholarly traditions. First is theological, where scholars wonder what God had to say about forgiveness, and they look to Scripture for that answer. Philosophers study, what does forgiveness mean, and is it possible for humans to actually forgive, as complicated and as difficult as that process really is? The therapeutic tradition looks at clinical interventions and wonders, can forgiveness be a process that heals hurt in families and marriages and communities? The peacemaking tradition looks at the role of peace and reconciliation processes in countries and in communities where ethnic strife and civil war has caused great harm. The legal approach considers restorative justice and the role of forgiveness in readmitting people to communities where they've broken laws or norms. And finally, the communicative approach to forgiveness is the way that I study forgiveness. The central question for communication scholars is, how is forgiveness talked into being? How do our language practices and our communication behaviors either help or hinder the process of forgiveness? So what is forgiveness? Well, first of all, it's an acknowledging that a serious hurt, harm, or wrongdoing has occurred. And the first communicative task in forgiveness is being able to describe that hurt and to acknowledge that it happened. A second important task is communicating and eventually revising our emotional responses to hurt and harm. Some of those emotions we call the moral emotions, emotions like guilt or anger. These are emotions we feel in response to moral transgressions when we feel like we've been wronged or we've done wrong in our relationships. Rehumanizing the offender is the third aspect of forgiveness. Here, we're trying to develop empathy for the person who hurt us, to better understand the complicated conditions that may have led to the transgression. Extending mercy is an important part of most forgiveness traditions. In simple terms, extending mercy means being kind to those who are unkind to you. It also means that you have every legitimate right to want revenge in this situation. But you decide to forgo that right in the interest of repairing a relationship or doing what to you feels like the right thing. And finally, forgiveness, at least as I study it, involves a renegotiating of moral commitments in our relationships, implementing new rules and agreements that help us live a relationship that feels right and good. Forgiveness researchers have identified a series of communication behaviors that seem to be really important in whether we can actually forgive in our relationships. The first of those is confessing, that is, admitting to wrongdoing without offering excuses. The second is labeling that wrongdoing, being able to articulate to a partner or a family member or a coworker what you did and why it was wrong. Expressing remorse is an emotional dimension of the process. We need to be able to articulate our own sense of sorrow and emotional pain at the harm that we have caused. Offering amends means attempting to make things right by offering compensation or at least pledging improved behavior in the future. And that leads to pledging improvement, the next behavior. We need to help the people we have hurt understand that the future will be different, that we understand what we did wrong and we're committed to make the future better than the past. Offering forgiveness is the way of releasing the offender, and those who forgive decide to put bygones in the past and to let go of grudges. And finally, renegotiating relational commitments are those practices that allow us to assert and propose new moral arrangements in our relationships, new agreements that will make us feel safe and right. I've studied forgiveness in a variety of contexts, in long-term marriages, amongst peers in schools, but today I want to talk briefly about the role of forgiveness in step-families. And I'll describe briefly what we call the positive step-family study. The research on step-parenting relationships is pretty clear. Oftentimes families who are starting anew as a step-family experience early strife and hurt. Conflict is common during the early phases of step-family life, and we're particularly interested in the step-parent-step-child relationship, where the research suggests that conflict is common and that creates considerable consternation for both child and parent. But the question is, why do some of these relationships become positive over the long term, despite the fact that nearly all of them experience early adversity? So we conducted what we call turning points interviews with 36 adult stepchildren. These were people who had lived years and even decades in a step-family relationship and had come to see that that relationship was now positive, even if it hadn't been in the past. Turning points interviews asked people to reconstruct the history of their relationships and to describe key points of change, positive or negative, in those relationships. As part of the interviews, we plot the trajectories of those relationships, marking places where they went up and down in terms of positivity and tracking over the whole course of the relationship. And then we circle back and we discuss each one of these turning points with the members of the relationship, probing with qualitative interviewing questions to find out, why did it change? What made it better? What made it worse? What happened during this important time in the relationship? Well, the results of this study showed us, first of all, that 78% of these people who experienced who were members of these step-family relationships reported a forgiveness turning point, a time when they explicitly had to ask for forgiveness or grant forgiveness to a step-parent or a step-child. And the qualitative analysis of these forgiveness moments ended up being quite interesting. It revealed 5 themes: whole family forgiveness, forgiveness as explicit acknowledgement, time, maturation, and acceptance, expressing vulnerability and compassion, and forgiveness deepens bonds. And I'll talk about each of those briefly. Theme 1, whole family forgiveness, is illustrated by this brief quote. A stepdaughter said, "It helped all of our relationships be good." And what she meant is that she decided to forgive her step-parent, a step-parent whom she'd held grudges against for many years, because she thought it would be better for the whole family if that relationship was healed. And part of that consideration was the fact that she now had her own children and a husband who she wanted to integrate into the family. And often, when we heard people talk about forgiveness in step-families, it wasn't just to heal a relationship with one person, but rather to make the whole family system work better. The second theme was forgiveness as explicit acknowledgement. This quotation illustrates that theme. "Hey, this has really bothered me, and I want to get this off my chest." Those are the words of a stepson to a stepfather. He had been carrying a grudge for many years, and he had a sense of bitterness that he was carrying with him. This kind of forgiveness event allowed people to give voice to those emotions they had been carrying for many decades and to move on to the future. The third theme was time, maturation, and acceptance. This quotation illustrates, "Now that I am older, I am accepting this person and we're moving on." This was a stepdaughter who had been in a step-parenting relationship for 20 years. The relationship had started when she was a young child, and over the development of that relationship, she came to understand the difficulties that her stepmother had experienced entering a new family, and that increase in understanding helped her to be more forgiving. And as the relationship matured, both parties felt like they had forgiven each other for things that had happened in the past. Theme 4, expressing vulnerability and compassion, is illustrated by this quotation. "Instead of yelling or screaming or getting into something physical, Henry, this person's stepfather, literally just hugged my brother, like gave him the biggest crazy bear hug until he stopped. This stepdaughter was describing a situation where a stepfather could have responded with anger to a brother who was out of control and experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil. The fact that her stepfather showed compassion in that situation allowed her to be much more compassionate for him. She forgave him after that event and talked about how the relationship became much stronger after. Theme 5 is forgiveness deepens bonds, and it's illustrated by this quotation. Forgiveness, changed our relationship. It made me trust her, and she could trust me. Many of our step-parent, stepchild pairs described or told stories about times when they had forgiven. And those stories were evidence of the strength of their relationship, as if to say, all relationships have difficult times, and we had them too. But what makes our relationship positive and strong is the fact that we could forgive and move on. So in conclusion, we've learned from this work that forgiveness is a way to make relationships feel right again, right in the sort of moral and ethical sense of the word. Forgiveness fosters relational resilience because it helps people bounce back from adversity and move forward with a stronger relationship. Forgiveness disrupts cycles of recrimination and alienation, and as Desmond Tutu said, we've come to agree there is no future without forgiveness.